the development of the purely symbolic character of money. One of the greatest advances made by mankind, the discovery of a new world out of the material of the old, is to establish a proportion between two quantities, not by direct comparison, but in terms of the fact that each of them relates to a third quantity and that these two relations are either equal or unequal. Two performances of entirely different quality are given. They become comparable if they display the same strength of will and self-sacrifice in relation to the required effort. Two destinies reveal very different degrees of happiness, yet they acquire immeasurable relation if each is interpreted according to the extent to which its bearer deserved his fate. Two movements with quite different velocities can be related and equated if we observe that the acceleration from the initial stage is identical in each case. A kind of homogeneity emerges, and not only for our feelings, between two elements which, differing in their substance, have an equal relation to a third or fourth element. The one thereby becomes a factor for the calculability of the other. Furthermore, no matter how incomparable two people may be in their ostensible qualities, the relation of each to another person establishes an equality between them, as soon as one of them shows the same degree of love or hatred, domination or subjection, towards a third person as the other does towards a fourth person. These relations have established the separateness of personal identity. As a final example, the perfection of works of art of different kinds could not be compared and their values could not be arranged on a scale, unless each of them first had a definite relation to the particular ideal of its own kind. From the problem, the material and the style of each work of art, there evolves a norm which the actual work approaches more or less closely, and it is this relation that makes it possible to compare even the most diverse works of art. The possible conformity of such relations to a norm produces an aesthetic cosmos, a precise order, an ideal homogeneity in relation to value, from the individual works which are initially quite heterogeneous. This is not only true for the world of art. Out of the material of our isolated valuations, there develops a pattern of graded significance. Disharmony is experienced only as a result of the desire for a consistent order and an inner relation of values. We owe this essential feature of our worldview to our ability to balance against each other not only two things, but also the relations of these two to two others, and so unite them by judging them equal or similar. Money, as a product of this fundamental power or form of our mind, is not only its most extreme example, but is, as it were, its pure embodiment. For money can express the value relation between things realized in exchange only by equating the relation between a specific sum and some general denominator, with the relation between a corresponding commodity and the totality of commodities available for exchange. Money is not, by its nature, a valuable object whose parts happen to have the same proportion to each other or to the whole that other values have to each other. The significance of money is only to express the value relations between other objects. It succeeds in this with the aid of man's developed intelligence, which is able to equate the relations between things even though the things themselves are not identical or similar. This ability only gradually evolves from the more primitive capacity to judge and express the identity or similarity of two objects directly, which is the source of the phenomena mentioned earlier that reflect the attempt to establish a direct relationship between money and its exchange values. In modern economies, this transition began with the mercantilist system. The efforts of governments to get as much coin as possible into the country were also guided, of course, by the principle much gets more, but the final purpose that these measures were intended to promote was the stimulation of industry and the market. The next stage beyond this was the discovery that the values that sustained this purpose did not result from money as a substance, but from the direct product of labor. It was much the same with the aims of state policy in earlier times, to acquire as much land as possible and to populate it with as many people as possible. Until the 18th century, it did not occur to any statesman that real national greatness could be promoted in any other way than by the acquisition of new territory. The justification of such aims under particular historical conditions, however, has not prevented the discovery that this kind of abundance is important only as a basis for dynamic development, which needs in fact only limited gains of such objects, land or money. It has become evident that the physical availability of a money equivalent becomes less and less essential for the increase of production and wealth, even though large amounts of money are sought not so much for themselves as for definite functional purposes. These purposes can be realized by free-floating processes not involving money in a substantial form, as the international exchange of goods illustrates. The significance of money as expressing the relative value of commodities is, according to our earlier discussion, quite independent of any intrinsic value. Just as it is irrelevant whether a scale, to measure space, consists of iron, wood or glass, since only the relation of its parts to each other, or to another measure, concerns us, so the scale that money provides for the determination of values has nothing to do with the nature of its substance. This ideal significance of money as a standard and an expression of the value of goods has remained completely unchanged, whereas its character as an intermediary, as a means to store and to transport values, has changed in some degree and is still in the process of changing. Money passes from the form of directness and substantiality in which it first carried out these functions to the ideal form, that is, it exercises its effects merely as an idea which is embodied in a representative symbol. The development of money seems to be an element in a profound cultural trend. The different levels of culture may be distinguished by the extent to which, and at what points, they have a direct relationship with the objects that concern them, and on the other hand by the extent to which they use symbols. The way of life is radically different according to whether religious needs are satisfied by symbolic services and formulas, or by a direct approach of the individual to God, whether the respective people for each other is manifested through established rules that indicate relative positions by specific ceremonies, or through informal courtesy, attachment and respect, whether purchases, agreements and contracts are made by simply making their content known, or are legalized and made binding by an external symbol of solemn undertaking, whether theoretical knowledge deals directly with sense reality or with its representation through general concepts and metaphysical or mythological symbols. But of course, these differences are not rigid. Rather, the history of mankind shows a continuous fluctuation between them. On the one hand, the symbolic representation of reality increases, but at the same time, as a counter-movement, symbols are constantly analyzed and reduced to their original foundation. I will mention a singular example of this. Sexual objects have long been concealed through propriety and shame, while the words referring to them were used without hesitation. Only in recent centuries have the words themselves come under the same interdict. The symbol was thus brought into agreement with the emotional attitude to reality. But in very recent times this connection has begun to be dissolved again. Naturalism in art has drawn our attention to the lack of differentiation and freedom in perception if the same sensations are attached to the word, which is a mere symbol used for artistic purposes, as to the object itself. The representation of indecency is not at all the same thing as an indecent exhibition, and the perception of reality must be distinguished from the symbolical world in which art, including naturalism, exists. Perhaps in these circumstances there emerges a greater freedom among educated people in talking about delicate subjects.